The chamber was already loud when I walked in. I could hear it from the corridor, a low, layered sound, like 100 separate conversations fighting to happen simultaneously in 12 different languages. My translator bead warmed behind my ear as the small device worked to keep pace, feeding me clipped fragments in real time. Concern, displeasure, impatience. The word human appeared in 6 different alien tongues before I had even pushed open the door. My name is Kale Vasquez. I was 41 years old, formerly a senior trade arbitration officer for the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, and on that particular morning, I was the only human being within 4 light years of this station. I'd been given a slim briefing folder, a dress uniform that fit poorly across the shoulders because no one had thought to measure me for it properly, and a single directive from Director Orn back on Earth that I had been turning over in my mind for the entire 3-day journey. Be grateful we got a seat at all, Vasquez. Don't embarrass us. I had read the briefing folder twice on the transport ship. I had read the attached terms document 3 times. I had slept perhaps 6 hours out of the 72 available. I had eaten irregularly and thought continuously and arrived at the station with a very specific understanding of what was about to happen and what I was going to do about it. I straightened my collar, pushed the chamber door open, and walked in. The Galactic Council chamber was nothing like any room I'd been inside in my life, and I had been inside some impressive rooms. It curved upward in a wide oval, the delegation platforms arranged in concentric rings, each one elevated slightly above the one below it, so that every species present could see every other species present without obstruction. 12 platforms, 12 civilizations. The ceiling above them was a transparent dome, and beyond the dome the stars hung still and cold against the black, and the pale blue gas giant that the station orbited cast long silver stripes of reflected light across the chamber floor below. I had studied the species assignments before arriving. The Veth Dominion held the center of the highest ring, the position that in 11,000 years of council history had never been occupied by anyone else. Their delegates were tall and silver gray, arranged in a formal row with the precise symmetry of civilization that had been doing this long enough that precision had become instinct. The Keth sat on a lower platform to the left, small, green-skinned, calm in a way that I was beginning to understand was practiced rather than natural. The Surai were near the back, their bioluminescence casting a soft, shifting light across the platforms around them. The Merrick, four-armed and extraordinarily still, occupied a position in the second ring. And then there were 11 more species, each with their histories and their alliances and their particular reasons for being in this room on this day. And then there was the human platform. One station, added 3 months ago when Earth's membership application had been approved, reluctantly, provisionally, with a set of conditions attached that I had read in the briefing folder and that I was going to discuss with the Council very shortly. The platform was positioned far to the right of the main cluster, as if it had been placed there by someone who was not entirely sure it belonged, but could not formally exclude it. I sat down in the chair. It was too wide for a human frame. I sat in it anyway. The session opened without any ceremony that I could identify. Counselor Draveth, the Veth speaker, rose from the central platform and began to speak. My translator bead rendered his words in a flat, neutral voice that stripped the alien cadence away and delivered pure, meaning directly into my ear. The matter before this council today is the formal resolution of the human territorial question. The terms have been prepared and reviewed by all relevant committees and have been shared in advance with the human delegation. We will proceed to formal presentation, after which the human representative will be invited to acknowledge the terms and confirm acceptance. A display screen appeared above the chamber floor, large, bright, oriented so that every platform could read it, and the terms materialized on it in 12 languages at once. I found the English column and read it carefully, even though I had read it before. Documents change when you read them in the room where they're going to be acted on. They become more real. The first clause required humanity to relinquish administrative control of the outer colonies. The document called this a managed transition of oversight authority in previously unregistered space. What it actually meant was 14 settlements across 3-star systems, representing approximately 200,000 people, built over 11 years by individuals and families and small companies who had crossed the dark between stars with whatever they could carry and had made something out of it. The clause referred to those settlements as a destabilizing expansion into unregistered space. I thought about a woman named Lucy Hartwell, who had been my contact officer for the outer colonies for 3 years, who had built a hydroponic facility on the fourth settlement from prefabricated modules and 12 volunteers and a great deal of work. I thought about what the word relinquish would mean to her. The second clause required the full dismantlement of humanity's faster-than-light development program. We had cracked the fundamental physics 18 months ago. It had been the most significant scientific achievement in human history, celebrated across every nation on Earth, broadcast on every channel, greeted with the specific kind of collective joy that humanity does not produce often but produces completely when it arrives. For thousands of scientists, 30 years of sustained effort. The Council's position was that an unsupervised human FTL capability constituted a navigational and security hazard to established transit corridors. The word dismantlement was not qualified or softened anywhere in the clause. It meant what it said. The third clause required a financial payment, described as an administrative contribution to the Veth Dominion, covering the costs of monitoring human space activity over the preceding decade. The number was specific and very large. I read it 3 times. It was not a rounding error. It was a number that would take Earth's entire space program budget 30 years to produce. I set the folder down on the platform railing. Draveth concluded his presentation with the smooth efficiency of someone who had guided dozens of species through this same process and had never needed to deviate from it. He turned toward the human platform with the expression of someone waiting for a formality to complete itself. Ambassador Vasquez. The Council extends these terms in the spirit of ordered and stable integration. Compliance will be formally noted in humanity's membership record and will form the foundation of a productive, ongoing relationship. Do you require additional time to review the terms before acknowledging? The chamber was quiet. Not completely. The ventilation system maintained its steady background hum, and somewhere behind me, a Surite delegate shifted with the soft, rustling sound their movements produced. But all conversation had stopped. 12 species were watching the human platform with varying degrees of attention and expectation. I looked at the terms on the screen one more time. I looked at the word relinquish. I looked at the word dismantlement. I looked at the number in the third clause. Then I looked at Draveth. No, I said, I don't need more time. He waited. We decline. The translator bead in my ear went completely silent for 3 full seconds. I found out about this later, much later, in a post-session analysis prepared by the Council's own communication staff that was leaked to the diplomatic community and eventually found its way to me. The linguistic processing system had paused because it had encountered a response that did not match any documented pattern in its 11,000 years of session records. Not because the word itself was unusual. Decline was a common word in 40 of the 60 cataloged Galactic languages. The problem was the context. In 11,000 years of formal integration sessions, no species presented with a resolution had refused it. They negotiated. They appealed. They requested extensions or amendments or phase timelines. Some had wept openly before the full chamber. One species, the Dora, had collectively lost consciousness at their platform, all 7 delegates simultaneously, which had required a medical team and a 40-minute recess. But none of them had simply refused. So the system searched. It went through 11,000 years of records looking for a precedent. It did not find one. The 3 seconds passed, and then the chamber erupted. The noise that followed was unlike anything I had heard in 12 years of diplomatic work, and I had heard some noise. It was not pure anger, or not only anger, though anger was certainly part of it. What struck me was the texture of the sound. There was shock in it, genuine and immediate, the sound of people who had walked through a door they were certain led somewhere familiar and found that the floor on the other side was not there. There was confusion, cascading, and overlapping as each species processed what had happened through its own cultural framework and found one after another, that the framework did not have a ready slot for this. Several delegates were on their feet before any formal procedure had been invoked. The Veth speaker was speaking rapidly, his translator feed fragmenting in my ear as it tried to keep up with speed and emotion simultaneously. The Keth platform erupted in their own language, high-pitched, rhythmic clicking. The Surai at the back dimmed suddenly, their bioluminescence dropping from a steady ambient glow to a low, anxious flicker that I recognized from my pre-mission reading as an involuntary physiological stress response, as uncontrollable as a blush. I sat very still. I want to be honest about my interior state in that moment, because stories about moments like this tend to clean them up in ways that are not true. I was not calm. My hands were flat on the platform railing, and I was pressing them down with deliberate force to keep the tension in my body from reaching my hands and becoming visible. My heart was doing things that a cardiologist would have found professionally interesting. The part of my brain that was responsible for assessing threatening situations had activated and was running several calculations at once, none of which were producing comfortable results. But I had read those terms 3 times, slowly, on the transport ship, in the long, quiet hours when there was nothing around me but dark and time. And I had thought about Lucy Hartwell and the 12 people who had helped her build the hydroponic facility. And I had thought about 4,000 scientists in 30 years and the sound of my neighbor knocking on the apartment wall on the night the FTL announcement came through, because the sound of the celebration in the street below was so complete that it passed through walls. And I had thought, very specifically, very carefully, about what it would mean to put my name on a document that called those things negotiable, that declared them available for surrender, that said, yes, we will give these things up because a room of very old and very powerful beings has decided that the simplest solution is for us to hand them over, and we are new here and we are small and we're grateful for the seat, and so we will sign. I had thought about all of that, and I had found, somewhere in the quiet of those long hours, that I could not do it. So I had not. Draveth was calling for order with increasing emphasis. The chamber noise reduced slowly, reluctantly, the way a crowd settles when it is not quite convinced that settling is the right response. When the room had come down to something that qualified as controlled, he looked at the human platform with an expression I could not fully read. His species' faces were less reflexively expressive than human ones, built for control and precision rather than immediate legibility. But the geometry of his posture communicated displeasure on a scale that needed no translation. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said. He was very careful with each word. "I need to ensure the translation was accurate. You're stating that the human delegation refuses the terms of this resolution." "Yes," I said. "In full, without exception, in full." Another wave through the chamber. Quieter this time, but heavier, the kind of response you feel in your chest rather than hear with your ears. "You understand," Draveth said, with the patience of a person who is containing something much larger than patience, that this council represents the governing authority for 800 inhabited systems. You understand that humanity's membership, your access to protected trade corridors, your standing under galactic law, your eligibility for council resources and mediation services is contingent on full and cooperative integration. "I understand that is your position," I said. "And I want to be clear, Counselor, I am not being disrespectful. I have genuine regard for what this institution represents and what it has built over a very long time. But respectful and compliant are 2 different things. I came here authorized to offer you one of them. I have offered it." He looked at me for a long moment. "This session will recess," he said. 30 minutes. They did not come back in 30 minutes. They came back in 4 hours. By that point, I had eaten the protein bar from my jacket pocket. I had always kept food in my pockets during field work, a habit I had never broken, consumed 2 cups of something the station service unit produced that approximated coffee with incomplete success, and read a message from Director Oren that contained the phrase, "What have you done?" in 4 separate paragraphs, and again in the subject line. I wrote back, "What you sent me here to do." I represented us honestly. His response to that message was silence, which I chose to interpret as agreement. When the session resumed, the chamber had reorganized itself. The initial shock had compressed, and hardened into something more deliberate. Draveth spoke again, with the careful precision of someone who had used the 4 hours to choose each word from a larger set and discard everything that did not serve him. The Council has discussed the human delegation's response at considerable length, he said. We wish to understand it more fully before determining how to proceed. Ambassador Vasquez, on what basis does humanity decline? I had thought about this question during the recess, sitting in my too-wide chair while the station hummed quietly around me. I had written several answers and eliminated all of them except one. On the basis that the terms are not fair, I said. The outer colonies were settled legally, in unclaimed space, by people who asked no one's permission because no permission was required under any applicable framework. The faster-than-light program was built by our scientists over decades and belongs to humanity. The reparations clause asks us to pay the cost of being monitored by a power that never announced it was monitoring us and never established any agreement under which that monitoring was requested or authorized. I pause for a single breath. We are not refusing to be part of this community. We are refusing to purchase our membership in it by surrendering the things that make us worth sitting here. The chamber was completely quiet. Then, from the lower left platform, the Keth delegate, a small, elderly being named Suran, who had said exactly 6 words to me before this session, raised his speaking indicator. Draveth acknowledged him. I noticed the pause before the acknowledgement, brief but present. Suran said, in a voice so soft that my translator bead had to amplify it to reach me clearly. The Keth would like to speak with the human ambassador after this session, if the ambassador is willing. It was a small statement, a simple request. But I watched Draveth's response to it, and I understood that something in the room had shifted, something that had nothing to do with me, something much older and much larger that had been waiting for exactly this kind of disturbance to remind it of what it was. I did not know yet what was going to happen next. I did not know whether any of this was going to hold, or whether the pressure that was already building would simply erase what I had done and return everything to where it had been. But I knew that 3 seconds of silence had cracked something open, and I was going to stay in the room and find out what came through. The 30 minutes they had promised stretched into 4 hours, and then into a full day, and then into something that no one in the station's integration bureau seemed willing to give a formal name to. I was escorted politely, persistently, with the specific firmness of people who are being professional about something that is not professional, to the human delegation suite on the station's 7th ring. 3 rooms, a sleeping area, a workspace, and a narrow lounge with a viewport that looked out across the dark toward the gas giant. The rooms were comfortable. The food service unit worked. The door was not locked, technically, because locking it would have been a provocation, and the Veth Dominion was not yet ready to make a provocation of that kind on the record. 2 Veth station officers stood in the corridor outside. When I tested the door in the first hour, opened it, looked out, made eye contact. One of them turned to face me with an expression that communicated, without any language at all, that a walk was not currently among my available options. So I stayed. I sat in the narrow lounge and looked at the gas giant through the viewport, and I read everything coming through on my secure feed, which was a great deal. Earth had been monitoring the council session through the diplomatic relay, receiving everything in near real time, and the reaction to what had happened in that chamber was complicated enough that I needed 3 passes through the incoming messages to build a coherent picture of it. Director Oren had sent me 7 messages in the first 2 hours. Each one was slightly more constrained than the previous, as if he were working toward a position, and each message represented a step in that process. The first was emotional. The 4th was analytical. The 7th was almost calm, which told me he had arrived somewhere and stopped moving. The president of Earth had sent a single message. It was 12 words. Ambassador Vasquez, please confirm you are well and that this was intentional. I confirmed both in that order in 2 separate sentences because they were 2 separate questions. The scientific community had sent nothing directly to me, but the feed carried fragments of their public response, and what struck me about it was not the content, but the speed. 37 hours after my refusal, the lead researchers on the FTL program had given a press conference on Earth in which they had laid out calmly, and in technical detail, exactly what the dismantlement clause would have required and exactly why it was not going to happen. They had not coordinated with me. They had not needed to. They had read the terms on the same broadcast feed that everyone else had, and they had drawn the same conclusion that I had drawn, and they had started talking publicly and clearly before anyone had issued any guidance about whether they should. I had thought about that for a while. Then came the message that changed the texture of my thinking. It arrived flagged, Priority 1, Origin Earth Defense Command, Admiral Clara Holt. It was 12 words, holding current posture. Tell us what you need. We are ready. I read those 12 words 3 times. I had worked with Clara Holt once, briefly, 5 years ago on a resourcing dispute that involved a small fleet deployment, and I remembered her as someone who communicated precisely, who chose 12 words because 12 words was exactly the right number, not because she could not have used more. Holding current posture. Tell us what you need. We are ready. The report attached to her message was the thing that shifted my understanding of what I was actually in the middle of. I read it in the lounge with the gas giant outside and the station humming quietly around me. And by the end of the first page, I had put down the almost coffee and given the document my full attention because it was describing something I had not known was happening. In the 72 hours between my departure from Earth and the council session, while I was on the transport ship reading terms and making decisions in the dark between stars, humanity had been doing things. The shipyards had shifted to continuous operation. Not gradually, not partially, fully, immediately, every available berth and crew running at capacity. The 14 outer colonies had received coded messages and had responded with confirmations of full operational readiness. The FTO research team had moved their primary data and their core personnel to 3 separate secure locations, distributed across 3 different star systems, on a precautionary protocol that had apparently existed in outline for over a year and had simply been waiting for an activation signal that had now arrived. And the fleet had moved. Our fleet, the one that Galactic analysts consistently described with words like nascent, limited, and not yet a significant strategic factor, had repositioned. Not toward anything. Not aggressively. Not in any direction that implied advance or threat. It had simply moved into better positions, the way someone who hears an unusual sound in a dark house reaches for the light, without knowing yet whether anything is actually wrong. 312 vessels, positioned in a formation that covered every approach to the outer colonies. Silent, unmoving. The report estimated that this deployment had been achieved in 72 hours from standing start. A VETH logistics department had already submitted an analysis flagging this as logistically inconsistent with catalog human capabilities and requesting further assessment from 3 separate modeling teams. Further assessment was ongoing. It had not yet produced a satisfying explanation, because the explanation was not in their models. The explanation was not a secret reserve or a hidden program or a technology the catalog had missed. The explanation was that when humans decided something needed to happen, they made it happen and sorted out the technical details of how later. 40,000 years of survival in an environment that had consistently tried to end human life through cold and heat and drought and disease and the sheer difficulty of existing on a geologically active planet with a complicated atmosphere, had produced something that did not appear in any galactic assessment document I had ever read. A civilization whose natural response to pressure was not to conserve but to produce. Not to protect what existed, but to build more, faster, right now before the situation could solidify around them. The models had measured our ships and our population and our industrial output. They had not measured that. I put the report down and sat for a while with the gas giant turning slowly outside the viewport. The knock at my suite door came in the second hour of my self-imposed analysis period. Not a station officer. The knock was different, lighter, the knock of someone who was choosing to be there rather than stationed there. I opened the door to a young VETH diplomat named Cosvel, who identified himself as an attaché to the Integration Bureau and who asked, with the kind of visible discomfort that I immediately found sympathetic, whether he might speak with me privately on an unofficial basis. I let him in and gestured toward the chair across from the lounge. He was younger than any of the Veth delegates I had seen in the chamber. His silver-gray complexion still carried a warmth that I had read faded with age in his species, an almost imperceptible undertone that the older officials had entirely lost. He sat and turned a small data tablet over and over in his hands without looking at it, a gesture I recognized immediately because I had been doing the same thing with my pen for the past 2 hours. "I want to be direct about why I am here," he said. "I'm not here officially. I am here because I am confused about something, and I find that confused people do better when they ask questions rather than making assumptions. My supervisor does not know I am here. I am choosing to be transparent about that. I appreciate both the directness and the transparency," I said. "Ask what you want to ask." He looked at the tablet in his hands. "Humanity has never engaged with a galactic-level power before. You have been a spacefaring civilization for less than a century. Your fleet is small. Your industrial base, by Council standards, is limited. You have no military alliances, no established relationships with any of the power blocks in this community. You have never won a confrontation with a civilization of this scale. There is genuinely no record of it." "All of that is accurate," I said. "Then why did you refuse?" he asked. "I'm not asking why you disagreed with the terms. I understand the disagreement. I am asking why you chose refusal when every other option was less dangerous." I thought about it. Not performing thought. Actually thinking, because the question was a real one and deserved a real answer. Because every other option required me to sign a document saying those terms were acceptable, I said, and I could not make myself believe they were acceptable, no matter how I looked at them. And I have found, over 12 years of arbitration work, that signing documents you do not believe are acceptable is always more expensive in the long run than refusing them in the short run. Because signed documents become the foundation for the next document, and the one after that, and eventually you look up and discover that you have signed your way into a position that you would never have accepted if someone had simply handed it to you on the first day. Cosvel was quiet. The tablet stopped moving in his hands. "There is also this," I said. "You mentioned that we have never won a confrontation with a civilization of this scale. That is true. We have also never lost one. We have not had one yet. And the most genuinely uncertain opponent in any situation is not the one you have beaten before. It is the one you have no record on. Your council has been studying us for a decade. You have measured everything measurable. But there are things that do not appear in measurements. And I think your analysts are starting to realize that." He looked at me directly. "The senior counselors are not afraid of humanity," he said. But the precise, careful way he said it communicated that the sentence had a complexity to it that the surface did not capture. "I know," I said. "I'm not trying to frighten anyone. I am trying to create a situation in which the most sensible thing available to everyone is to negotiate honestly. Fear closes people down. Uncertainty opens them up. I would rather have a council that is uncertain about us than one that is afraid of us." He left about an hour after that. He did not tell me what he intended to do with the conversation. I did not ask, because I already knew from the particular way he had paused at the door before leaving, a half-second of internal decision, that he was going to report it. Not to damage me, because he was genuinely trying to understand what was happening, and understanding required bringing information back to the people he was part of. Telling his supervisors, "This conversation happened and here is what was said, and I think it matters that you know." I thought that was exactly the right thing to do. That night, I wrote in the journal I had kept since leaving Earth orbit. I did not write about strategy or protocol. I wrote about my father, who had been a construction foreman for 30 years, who had built things in hard conditions and difficult weather and with crews that were never quite large enough and budgets that were never quite sufficient, who had told me once, when I was 12 and afraid of something I can no longer name, "Kale, fear does not go away. You just get so used to carrying it that it stops slowing you down." Outside the viewport, the gas giant turned. 312 human ships held position in the dark somewhere beyond it, still and patient and ready. Admiral Holt was standing in some operations room with 12 words already spoken and nothing left to add until something moved. Nothing was moving. That was correct. That was exactly right. The session resumed the following morning. I was escorted back to the chamber by the same two officers who remained professionally silent the entire way and opened the door for me at the end without being asked, which I interpreted as a small gesture of something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. The chamber felt different when I walked in. The initial shock had completed its journey through the room and settled into something harder. The delegates who had been on their feet the day before were seated now, contained, deliberate. The Veth row was immaculate in its arrangement again, but the quality of the attention in the room had changed. Before my refusal, the chamber had been a room where something expected was about to happen. Now it was a room where something unexpected had already happened, and the room was still working out what it meant. Draveth was in his seat. When he looked at the human platform, he held the look for a fraction of a second longer than the previous day. Then he began. He announced that the council was moving into extended deliberation on the human question, and that the human delegation would be asked to provide a written statement of its formal position within 2 hours. I said I would have one ready. He said the session would resume when the deliberation concluded. What he did not announce, what no one in the chamber said aloud, was what had arrived overnight in every delegate's secure data feed. I had the numbers in front of me on my own tablet. 312 human vessels, silent and motionless, covering every approach to the outer colonies. A logistics estimate flagged as anomalous. 3 separate analysis departments still trying to produce a coherent explanation for the 72-hour deployment. I watched the room while Draveth spoke. I watched the Keth platform, where Suran sat with his hands folded and his large eyes steady and calm. I watched the Surai delegates, dimmer than they had been the day before, not the anxious flicker of initial shock, but a lower, more interior light, like someone sitting alone in a dark room, thinking carefully. I watched the Mara platform, where Orcan sat with the complete stillness that a species seemed to maintain as a baseline, for arms arranged with the precision of someone who does nothing by accident. I watched the Veth row, and I watched Draveth specifically, and I saw the thing I'd been looking for, the absence of certainty. Not confusion, not fear. The Veth had too much discipline for those to surface visibly. But the particular absence that happens when something a person was completely confident about has turned out to require recalculation. The kind of absence you can only see if you have spent years watching people negotiate with things they did not expect. I had spent 12 years watching exactly that. I wrote 2 words in a margin of my notepad and underlined them once. 3 days later, the council's fleet arrived. I say that sentence without preamble because that is how it arrived. Not with warning or build-up, but as a single line in a priority-marked message at 4:17 station time, in the quiet of what passed for night aboard the station. I was asleep when it came through. My communicator made the specific sound it made only for Priority 1 messages, and I was out of the sleeping area and at the workspace before I was fully conscious of having moved. 40 Veth warships dropped out of faster-than-light transit 200,000 kilometers from the outer colonies. In formation, silent, no communication sent to the settlements, to Earth, to the council session I was still formally engaged in. They had simply arrived, arranged themselves in a configuration that was unmistakably military, and held position. I sat at the workspace in the dark of the sleeping area's small light and read the full report twice. Then I made myself a cup of the almost coffee and read it a 3rd time. Not because the information changed between readings, because I needed the time to let my heart return to a pace that was compatible with careful thinking. The official council explanation arrived in my suite 2 hours later, delivered by a junior integration officer named Pelva, who had the look of someone who had drawn an assignment they genuinely wished had gone to someone else. She read from a prepared statement informing me that the Veth fleet deployment represented a standard peacekeeping posture and a routine demonstration of council authority in contested space, and that the human delegation should not interpret the deployment as anything other than a standard procedural measure. I thanked her. I asked her to convey my acknowledgement to the relevant parties. I did not say anything else. As soon as she left, I opened my private channel to Admiral Holt. Her response came back in 11 minutes. 11 minutes told me she was already awake and already watching, that the deployment had reached her screens before my message reached her inbox. We see them, she wrote. Been tracking since they left Veth space. Kale, we have 312 ships on station. I have given them exactly one order. Do you want to know what it is? I wrote, yes. Hold position, she wrote. Do not fire. Do not approach the Veth vessels. Do not transmit anything except routine navigation signals. If the Veth fleet broadcasts to us, acknowledge receipt and say nothing further. We're going to stand here and let them decide what that means. I read that response carefully. Then I wrote back, Clara, that is exactly correct. She did not reply, which meant she had already returned to whatever she had been doing. I imagined her in some operations room, watching screens, her fleet doing the same thing she was doing, holding position, being very, very still. I went back to the sleeping area. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and breathed and thought about what was happening 200,000 kilometers from 14 settlements where people were going through their mornings, making food, running systems, looking at the same skies they always looked at, while 40 warships hung just outside their horizon like a conversation that had not yet been completed. I thought about Lucy Hartwell in her hydroponic facility. I thought about whether she knew. I hoped, if she did, that she was carrying it with the same steadiness that Admiral Holt was projecting from 4 light years away. I thought she probably was. The session that morning was the most interesting one yet, because of what was not said. Draveth called it to order with his usual precision. He addressed the fleet deployment by describing it again as a routine measure, using almost the same words Pelva had delivered to my suite, and looking at me as he did it with the expression of a person who is making a statement and simultaneously watching to see what the statement does to the listener. I kept my face neutral and attentive. Ambassador Vasquez, he said, we expect the human fleet in the vicinity of the outer settlements to stand down. The continued presence of an armed formation in council-monitored space without authorization is a procedural irregularity that requires immediate resolution. I had thought about this exact question for most of the sleepless night. Our fleet has no orders to fire on anyone, I said. It has no orders to approach the Veth vessels or to take any action that could reasonably be described as interference. It has orders to hold its current position and not retreat. I kept my voice even and my tone honest. What happens beyond that point depends entirely on how events develop. I am telling you the truth about that because I think honesty serves this council better than a polished answer would. If the Veth fleet withdraws, nothing happens. If they advance, the situation will be assessed as it develops. The decision about what that assessment produces has not been made because it does not yet need to be made. The chamber was very quiet. Then Draveth said, "Session will recess." 6 hours. During those 6 hours, 3 people came to my door. They came separately with gaps between visits, and each conversation was different. Suran arrived first, sat quietly, and told me that the Keth had been paying tribute to the Veth Dominion for 311 years and had never once considered that refusal was possible. Not because they lacked the desire, because no one had ever demonstrated that the space for it existed. Then the young Surai delegate, who told me her name was Elisvar and who asked careful, technical questions about Earth's legal framework for colonial rights. Then Orcan of the Merrick, who sat down, looked at me directly and told me he had voted against humanity's membership application 14 months ago, not because he did not want us in the council, but because the terms of admission were unfair and he believed the council should have fixed them before extending the invitation. He had been overruled. He had complied with the outcome because that was what you did when you were overruled. He was no longer certain that complying was the only option available. When the session resumed, the Veth fleet was still in position. Our fleet was still in position. Nothing had moved. Everything was in exactly the same place it had been 6 hours earlier, except that the room had used those 6 hours to arrive somewhere new. Draveth opened the session and said, "The Council wishes to discuss a revised framework for human integration." It was not an apology. It was not a concession. It was an opening, the narrowest possible opening, barely enough for a conversation to pass through. But it was the first one. And I had learned over 12 years of arbitration work that the first opening, however small, was the only one that mattered because every subsequent opening grew from it. I leaned forward in my too-wide chair. "We're listening," I said. The Veth fleet and our fleet held their positions for 4 days without moving. I know from the outside that sounds like nothing happened. From inside the station, inside those rooms, watching the feeds and the analysis reports and the council's increasingly complicated internal communications that were leaking in fragments to every delegation on the station, something was happening constantly. It just was not the kind of thing that made noise. I had been in arbitration rooms where silence lasted 6 hours and contained more movement than a shouting match. I understood silence as a medium through which things traveled. I understood that what was happening out there in the space between two fleets that were not firing on each other was the most important part of everything that had occurred since I walked in a council chamber and said 2 words. Both fleets were deciding what the other one was. The Veth had a framework for this. They had encountered standoffs before, not with humanity specifically, but with other species in the early stages of their expansion, back when the Dominion was still consolidating its position in what would become its core territory. Their doctrine for situations like this was documented, studied, predictable. Apply pressure through positioning. Maintain communication silence to create uncertainty on the other side. Wait for the smaller party to blink. Their doctrine assumed the smaller party would blink. Our fleet had not received a doctrine for this situation because this situation had not existed before. What they had received was Admiral Holt's one order: hold position, do not fire, do not retreat, do not transmit anything except routine navigation signals. Let the other party decide what your presence means. The elegant thing about that order, the thing I kept coming back to in the nights when I could not sleep and would sit at the workspace reading reports, was that it created a problem the Veth doctrine had no solution for. Their doctrine was built on the assumption of asymmetric resolve, that a larger, older, more established power could simply outlast a smaller one because the smaller one had more to lose from the standoff continuing. But our fleet was not showing any sign of having more to lose. It was holding its position with the specific, patient stillness of a thing that could do this indefinitely, and the Veth analysts were running models trying to figure out why, and the models kept producing results that did not make sense under their existing assumptions about human behavior. One of those reports reached me through a channel I will not describe in detail, courtesy of a source I will not name. It was an internal Veth logistics and strategic assessment, 14 pages, marked for restricted distribution within the Dominion's Council delegation. I read it twice. The core of it was a single sentence in the summary on page 2. Current human fleet behavior does not match any documented pattern from prior first contact or integration disputes, and attempts to model likely near-term human decision-making have produced results with insufficient confidence intervals to be operationally useful. Insufficient confidence intervals to be operationally useful. In the specific and careful language of strategic analysis, that sentence meant, we do not know what they are going to do, and we do not have enough information to build a reliable prediction, and that absence of prediction is a problem. I thought about my father building things in weather that was not supposed to be buildable in, bringing crews to sites that the project timeline had not accounted for, producing structures that the original specifications had not quite imagined. I thought about the way he would look at a situation that had gone sideways and say, very calmly, all right, so we're doing it differently now. Not with distress, not with drama, with the particular equanimity of someone who had spent a lifetime adjusting to conditions as they actually were rather than as they had been anticipated to be. Our fleet was doing something similar. It had been given a situation that no human fleet had ever been in before, and it was handling it with the same adaptive calm that humans have been applying to impossible situations since before we left our home planet. The Veth did not have a model for that. They had a model for species that panicked under pressure. They had a model for species that calculated odds and retreated when the odds turned against them. They had a model for species that issued escalating communications when a standoff dragged on too long, communications that told you exactly what the other side was thinking and feeling and how close they were to making a decision. They did not have a model for a fleet that simply sat there, quiet and steady and completely illegible. In the council chamber, the recess stretched from 6 hours into a second day and then a third. Draveth sent me 2 formal communications during this period informing me that the Council's deliberations were ongoing and that the human delegation should maintain its current status pending the completion of those deliberations. I responded to both with acknowledgments that were polite and said nothing of substance. On the second day of the extended recess, Cosvel came back. He did not knock this time with the tentative tap of the first visit. He knocked with a little more confidence, like someone who had made a decision about something and was following through on it. I let him in. He sat in the same chair. He did not turn the tablet over in his hands this time. He held it still. I spoke to my supervisor about our previous conversation. He said, "Not the content. I did not report the content. I told him I had spoken with you and found the conversation useful for my understanding of the situation. He told me to be careful." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I said I would be transparent." "I appreciate that," I said. "I also spoke to my parents," he said. He looked at the viewport rather than at me. "They are both administrators. Senior ones. They have spent their careers in the Dominion Civil Service. I told them what you said about fear and what it does to you over time. About carrying it until it stops slowing you down." He paused again. "My father said it was an interesting thing to say, but that humans tended toward irrational optimism, and this was probably an example of that." He almost smiled. "My mother said she was going to think about it." "Your mother sounds like a wise person," I said. "She has been in this service for 40 years, he said. She has processed a great many integration agreements. She told me, when I was young, that the hardest part of the work was not the negotiations themselves. It was the moment when you realized that the outcome you were about to produce was the same outcome you had produced the last time and the time before that, and that the same outcome would be produced again after you were gone." He looked at me. "I do not think she has said that to many people. I think she said it to me because she thought I should know it early." I looked at him for a moment. "What do you think that outcome is?" "I think," he said carefully, "that the outcome has always been that smaller species pay and larger species benefit and the structure continues. And I think my mother is tired of producing it." He set the tablet on his knee. "I do not know what the council is going to do. I am not senior enough to know. But I think there are people inside this deliberation who are also tired of producing the same outcome, and that your refusal has given them something to point to, something that did not exist before." He left 20 minutes later. I stood at the viewport after he was gone and looked at the pale blue gas giant and thought about his mother, a civil servant somewhere in the Veth Dominion's administrative structure who had spent 40 years producing the same outcome and was tired. I thought about how many people like her there were in the vast machinery of this community, people who had long since quietly decided that things were not quite right, but had found no moment and no mechanism through which to say so. I thought about what it might mean that they now had one. On the 4th day of the extended recess, I received a message from Admiral Holt that was not a status update or a fleet positioning report. It was a personal message, 3 sentences long. I have been in command positions for 18 years. I have never commanded a fleet that did nothing, and I have never felt so certain that doing nothing was correct. Whatever you're doing in there, keep doing it. I wrote back, "You have a harder job." "I'm just talking." She replied, "Talking is the hard job, Kale. I just park ships." I laughed, alone in my suite, for the first time since I had left Earth. It was a short laugh, but it was real, and it helped. The session resumed on the morning of the 5th day. I was escorted back to the chamber by Pelva, the junior integration officer, rather than the station officers. This was a small change in protocol, and small changes in protocol were the council's way of communicating things it was not yet ready to communicate directly. Escorted by a station officer meant you were being managed. Escorted by an integration officer meant you were being engaged. The chamber felt different from every previous session. The quality of the attention had changed again. In the first session, the room had been watching me with a combination of condescension and curiosity. In the subsequent sessions, the attention had been something more complicated, alert, evaluative, uncertain. Now the room felt like it was waiting for something rather than observing something. Like the decision had been made, and the space was holding itself ready for the moment when it would be said aloud. Draveth was in his seat. When he looked at me, his expression was controlled as always, but the specific quality of the control had changed. Before, the control had been the easy, automatic control of someone managing a familiar situation. Now it was the more effortful control of someone managing an unfamiliar one. I noticed that. He called a session to order. The council has completed its internal deliberations regarding the human integration situation, he said. We are prepared to present a response. He began laying out what that response was. The recognition of the outer colonies as sovereign human territory. A registration and boundary framework, administratively necessary, structured around mutual agreement rather than unilateral determination. The word sovereign, present and not qualified into meaninglessness. The continued operation of the Human Faster Than Light program. A joint safety review committee with human delegates as full members to address navigational implications. Reasonable, collaborative. The kind of structure I would have proposed myself if asked what fairness looked like in this context. The withdrawal of the reparations clause, replaced by a mutual trade framework that was equitable in structure and included provisions for periodic review. And then a new clause that had not appeared in any document I'd seen. Short, simple, 14 words, placed at the end of the compact of equals that the council was formally proposing. I learned afterward that Sue Rand had written the first draft of it, that Orcan had contributed to the second, that Alisvar had proposed the final phrasing, and that two Veth delegates who had not spoken publicly during any of this had approved its inclusion during the closed deliberations and had done so without informing the rest of the Veth row in advance. 14 words. No species shall be compelled to negotiate the terms of its own diminishment. I read those 14 words in the document that Draveth presented, and then I read them again, and I set the document down on the railing in front of me. Ambassador Vasquez, Draveth said. His voice had a fraction less flatness in it than any previous session. A fraction was enough to notice. Does the human delegation find these terms acceptable? I thought about 200,000 people who would not know their settlements were being called sovereign until they read it in a message from Earth. I thought about 4,000 scientists and 30 years and the sound of my neighbor's knock on the apartment wall. I thought about Admiral Holt's 3 sentences and the fleet holding still in the dark for 4 days without a single unnecessary transmission. Yes, I said. We do. Suran raised his speaking indicator. Draveth acknowledged him. Suran stood. He stood and said, The Keth formally support the acceptance of these terms and the creation of the Compact of Equals. Then Orkin stood. Then Alisvar. Then 2 delegates from species I had not yet spoken with directly, a Mirren representative and a Torath attaché, rose from their platforms in the 3rd ring. 5 species, standing. None of them the largest. None of them the most powerful. But 5 species who had, until this week, been accepting terms and sitting quietly in their seats and waiting for something to change that never changed on its own. They were standing now. I looked at the Veth row. Draveth's face gave away nothing, which was itself a kind of information. He looked at the standing delegates, and I saw in the very slight, very controlled adjustment of his posture the specific calculation of a person who was revising a position that they had considered settled. The Veth Dominion was not going to change everything today. That was not how things like this worked, and I was not expecting it to. What I was watching was the beginning of a process that would take years, and that would not be smooth. Old structures did not simply stand aside because something new had appeared. They adjusted, partially grudgingly, in ways that preserve as much of themselves as the new situation would allow. But they adjusted. That was the point. That was the only point. Not perfection. Adjustment. And when the adjustment came from a room full of beings who had been sitting still for a long time, it carried more weight than any adjustment imposed from outside could have. I looked at Suran, still standing on the Keth platform. He looked back at me with those large, calm eyes. I nodded once. He nodded once in return. In the dark somewhere far from here, Admiral Holt's fleet received its stand-down order and began the long, quiet journey home. The Compact of Equals took 2 more days of document work to produce in final form, and I want to be honest about those 2 days because they were harder in some ways than everything that had come before. The hard part of reaching an agreement is the moment after you reach it, when the room exhales and you pick up your pen and look at the blank space where the specific language needs to go. Because that is when you discover all the ways in which the agreement that seemed clear in principle becomes complicated in detail. That is when the parties who agreed on a direction discover that they had been imagining slightly different destinations. The legal teams arrived on the morning after Draveth's presentation. A senior Veth law officer named Tarvin and his three-person team. A Keth legal advisor whom Suran had requested be included and who arrived carrying a paper document that looked older than anything else in the room. A Merrick legal expert who spoke very little but caught errors in the draft language that everyone else had missed, and my own team, which was me and a legal analyst named Owen Grant who had been on the station for 3 weeks doing preliminary work and who arrived at my suite on the morning of the document sessions looking like someone who had not expected to actually be needed. Owen was excellent. He had a very specific gift for reading dense legal language and identifying the 2 or 3 places in any given clause where someone could argue later that the clause meant something other than what the drafting parties had intended. He found 6 such places in the first 4 hours of review, and we fixed all 6, and the document was better for it. I also had a 2-hour argument with Tarvin about the exact meaning of the word equitable across 3 different species legal traditions, which ended with us agreeing on a definition that neither of us was entirely happy with, but which we both understood to be the best definition achievable given the disagreement we were working across. I had always been told the negotiated definition that both parties find slightly unsatisfying is a sign of a successful negotiation. I had not always believed it. Sitting across from Tarvin, I believed it. During a break on the first day of document work, I went back to my suite and found that Cosvel had left a handwritten note under the door. It was brief. It said, "My mother wants to meet you before you leave." I told her I would ask, then his contact information and a time. I wrote back that I was available. She was not what I had expected, which was my own failure of imagination. I had built a mental image from the fragments Cosvel had offered. 40 years in the civil service, tired of producing the same outcome. And the image was of someone older, more guarded, more worn by the weight of the thing she carried. The actual person who arrived at my suite that evening was precise and direct and had the specific quality of someone who had spent a long time being careful in public and had, at some point fairly recently, decided to be less careful. Her name was Vale Sue. She sat down without preamble and said, "I have read the transcript of your session. All of it. The refusal, the recess, the subsequent sessions. I reviewed the full record." "All right," I said. "I want to ask you something directly," she said. "When you refused in that moment, when you said the words, did you believe it would produce this outcome? The compact, the clause, the delegation's standing?" I thought about the honest answer. "No," I said. "I believed it was the correct response to an incorrect situation. I did not know what it would produce. I could not have predicted this specifically." She nodded, as if this was the answer she had expected. "That is what I thought," she said. "I have been in this service for 40 years. I have worked on 47 integration agreements. I have reviewed hundreds more. And the thing I have learned about the process, the thing no one will say in any official document, is that the outcomes are not produced by the strongest argument. They are produced by whoever is most committed to the outcome they are trying to reach." She looked at me steadily. "You did not have a stronger argument than the Veth. You did not have more power or more resources or more allies. You had more commitment to a specific position than anyone in that chamber had seen from a species at your stage of development, and the room did not know what to do with it. Is that good or bad?" I asked. "It is new," she said. "In this community, new is very uncomfortable. But new is also the only thing that changes anything." She stood. "I wanted to see what you were like. My son has good instincts, but he is young, and I do not always trust that young instincts are reading situations accurately." She paused at the door. He was reading this one accurately. She left. I sat for a while after she was gone, thinking about 47 integration agreements and the weight of producing the same outcome enough times to become tired of it. The document was completed on the afternoon of the second day and signed that evening. I had brought a pen from Earth specifically for this moment. An actual physical pen, bought from a small shop near my apartment in a city that was 4 light years away right now. I had thought, in the weeks before my departure, that a signature this significant should be made with something real, something that took up actual space in the physical world and left a mark that was genuinely made rather than digitally recorded. The signing table had been set up in a small room adjacent to the main chamber. Neutral space, deliberately modest, which I thought was the right choice. The 12 species representatives were present. The legal teams were present. Pelva was there, and she looked less uncomfortable than she had at any previous point in the process, which I chose to interpret as a sign that something about the outcome was less objectionable to her than the situation that had preceded it. Dravet signed first, because the Veth always signed first. Then Suran, who took the pen from me when I offered it and turned it over in his hands for a moment before signing, as if he wanted to feel the weight of it. Then Orcan. Then Elisvar. Then the others. Then me. I signed my name at the bottom of the document in the English section with a pen from a shop near my apartment, and the mark it left was dark and real and permanent. Several of the alien delegates watched the pen with expressions I read as a combination of curiosity and something more considered. An actual physical mark, made by an actual physical tool, in an age when everything could be recorded digitally and signatures could be produced by a thumbprint or scan. I thought that the physicalness of it said something that the digital alternative could not have said. I was not entirely sure what it said, but I thought it said something. The document was transmitted to Earth on the fastest relay available. Director Oren's response arrived 4 hours later. One sentence. We're proud of you. I read that sentence twice and put down my communicator and sat with it for a while. That night, the Compact of Equals was officially registered in the Council's permanent record, in 12 languages simultaneously, with automatic distribution to every species in the 800 inhabited systems that fell under Council jurisdiction. In every integration bureau on every Council member world, a notification appeared in the queue for senior review. New foundational clause added. Compact of Equals. 14th article. See attached. 14 words. No species shall be compelled to negotiate the terms of its own diminishment. In the Ket's home system, 300 light years from this station, a mid-level government official read the notification and flagged it for urgent distribution to the Foreign Affairs Bureau. The Keth had been members of the Galactic Council for 311 years. This was the first time in that period that any foundational document had contained language of this specific kind. On 6 other worlds, small species, junior members, long-standing payers of various forms of tribute, similar notifications appeared in similar queues, and similar officials flagged them for urgent review, and the urgent review in each case produced the same question. What does this mean for us specifically in practice going forward? That question would take years to answer. The compact was a beginning, not a resolution. I knew that. Suran knew it. Even Orcan, who had voted against our admission and argued for it anyway, and stood in the chamber and said so out loud, knew it. The Veth Dominion was not going to become something fundamentally different because of 14 words in a document. Its power was real. Its interests were real. Its 300-year position in this community was not going to be rearranged by one anomalous council session in which a species that had been spacefaring for less than a century refused an integration agreement and held that refusal long enough for the room to recalculate. But the 14 words were there, agreed to, signed by the Veth delegation. Permanent. And in this community where everything was governed by documents and every document was built on the foundation of the ones that came before, something being written down was not a small thing. On the morning after the signing, I walked to Suran's delegation office and knocked on the door. He let me in. We sat across from each other in chairs that were both too big, because the furniture in all the council offices had been built to a general standard that worked better for some species than others. What happens now? I asked. He folded his hands in his lap. There will be pressure to narrow the interpretation of the new clause, he said. It will begin within the year. There are species whose interests are served by the previous arrangement, and who will argue that the clause is procedural rather than substantive, that it establishes a general principle but does not alter specific existing agreements. He paused. We will need to argue back, consistently over a long time in many different venues. The Keth will do that. I asked. We have been waiting for a framework to do it under, he said. We have it now. He looked at me with those large, calm eyes. You will also need to be part of the argument. Humanity will need to be visible and active in this community, not aggressively, not expansively, but consistently. A species that shows up once and then recedes does not change anything permanently. A species that stays and participates changes the character of the room it is in. That sounds like a long commitment, I said. It is, he said. Everything meaningful is. I thought about that on the transport ship back to Earth, which was a 3-day journey in the opposite direction from the one I had taken to arrive here. I sat in a chair that fit me properly for the first time in 2 weeks and looked out at the stars and thought about what Suran had said. A species that stays and participates changes the character of the room it is in. I thought about what it was going to take to do that. Not just diplomatically. The Corps had people and training, and Owen Grant was already writing the briefing document for the next wave of human delegates who would be attending sessions in the coming months. Practically, systemically, the ways in which becoming a genuine participant in this community, rather than a newcomer with a provisional seat who had gotten lucky once, would require sustained presence and sustained effort over a span of time that extended well beyond any individual career. I thought about what it would mean for the people in the outer colonies. Not just the recognition of their sovereignty, though that mattered enormously, and I had read their collective response to the news, which was 14 messages from 14 colony administrators, all saying essentially the same thing in different language, which was, "Thank you, and we knew you would." I thought about what it would mean for them to know that the framework surrounding their lives had changed, that the document governing the space they occupied had a new clause in it that had not been there before. I thought about Lucy Hartwell in her hydroponic facility. I thought about whether she had read it yet. She had. She sent me a message on the second day of the return journey. It was 1 paragraph. It said, "We heard. All of us heard. I want you to know that we have been working at full capacity since the first session. We did not stop. We just kept building, and we would have kept building regardless of how any of this went. But it is better this way. It is much better this way. Come and visit us when you can." I wrote back that I would. I'm in it. On the 3rd day, looking at the stars from my seat on the transport ship, I wrote the last entry in my mission journal. I did not try to summarize everything that had happened. That kind of summary would come later in the formal report to the Corps and the official diplomatic record, and eventually in whatever version of these events was taught in schools and analyzed in academic papers and argued about in the way that significant moments always are, with different parties emphasizing different elements depending on what they needed the story to mean. What I wrote was simpler. I wrote about the pen, about Suran standing up, about Cosvel's new smile and his mother's 40 years, about Admiral Holt's 3 sentences and the fleet holding position for 4 days in perfect silence, about the specific quality of 3 seconds of silence in a room full of beings who had never heard the word "no" said in quite that way before. And I wrote, at the end, something my father had told me that I had been thinking about since I sat down in the 2-wide chair on the human platform in the Galactic Council chamber and read a set of terms that were not fair and decided what I was going to do about them. He had said, "The point is not to never be afraid. The point is to be afraid and still show up." We had shown up. Earth was 3 days away. I closed the journal and watched the stars and let myself be, for a few hours, just a tired person going home. I wrote the formal mission report in my apartment in the first 2 weeks after I returned to Earth, which is not how formal mission reports are usually produced. They're usually written in Corps offices by teams, with input from multiple departments, reviewed at several stages before submission. I wrote mine at my kitchen table in the mornings, with actual coffee that was actually coffee, looking out at the city that was loud and complicated and completely familiar in the way that only your own home can be familiar. "Director, Orrin let me do it this way." He called me on the second morning after I got back, and he sounded different than he had in the messages during the sessions. Less strained, more like the person I had worked with for 6 years before this assignment. He said, "Take your time with it. Write it properly. And, Kale, Take some actual time first. You look like you haven't slept in a month. I had not slept well in about a month, but I was home, and the coffee was real, and the city was outside, and after 2 days of sleeping without a communicator alert on my nightstand for the first time in weeks, I started writing. The formal report ran to 93 pages. It covered the session transcripts and the legal proceedings and the terms of the compact of equals in technical detail, and it included a full assessment of each of the species represented in the chamber and their likely positions on the new framework going forward. It included recommendations for the shape of Earth's ongoing council engagement, a staffing proposal for the diplomatic corps team that would need to be in place on the station within 6 months, and a resource allocation request for the next phase of the FDL program's joint safety review process. It was thorough and professional and complete, and I was proud of it. What I could not put in the formal report, what did not belong in a 93-page document that was going to be reviewed by 3 departments and eventually archived in the Corps' permanent record, was the texture of the experience. The weight of sitting in a too-wide chair for 12 days. The specific quality of the silence in the chamber when the translator bead went quiet. The way Suran had taken the physical pen from me and turned it over in his hands before signing. The conversation with Vale Sue about 47 integration agreements and the accumulated exhaustion of producing the same outcome. I put those things in the journal instead. The journal was not for anyone else. But I wrote it carefully because I thought that the things that did not belong in formal records were often the things that mattered most to actually understand what had happened. The formal record could tell you what the outcome was. The journal might help someone someday understand why it was possible. In the 3 months after I returned, several things happened simultaneously in ways that had been set in motion by the sessions, but that were now developing on their own momentum. The Keth initiated formal diplomatic talks with Earth's core through the new framework channels established by the compact. Suran led the Keth delegation himself, which I was told was unusual. Senior delegates typically sent subordinates to opening stage talks. He sent me a brief message when the first session was confirmed. It said, "We are doing this carefully, but we are doing it." The Surai sent an inquiry about Earth's agricultural technology, specifically the hydroponic systems used in the outer colonies. Lucy Hartwell was consulted. She responded to the inquiry with 40 pages of technical documentation and an invitation for their research team to visit the 4th settlement, which she said had expanded significantly since the compact was signed and would benefit from the exchange. The Surai accepted the invitation. Owen Grant, my legal analyst, was promoted and assigned to lead the human delegation's ongoing council engagement team. He sent me a message when the appointment was confirmed. It was 2 sentences I did not expect to be needed. "I'm glad I was there." I wrote back that I was glad too, and that the 6 places in the document he had caught were worth every subsequent hour of the assignment. Cosvel sent 1 message in the month after I returned to Earth. It came through the formal channel rather than the private one, which told me it was something he had thought carefully about. It said, "I am being transferred to the compact of equals monitoring office, which is a new department. It did not exist a month ago. I will be working on implementation. I thought you would want to know." I wrote back that I was glad he was in that role, and that the monitoring office was one of the more important things to come out of the proceedings, even if it would not appear in many of the summaries. The Veth Dominion's response to the compact, in the months following the signing, was exactly what I had expected and what Suran had predicted. They did not immediately challenge the document. They began, quietly and methodically, a campaign of interpretive pressure, submitting advisory opinions to the Council's legal bureau arguing that the 14th Article's language was general in nature and not applicable to specific existing agreements. The arguments were sophisticated. They were made by people who had been doing this for a very long time. They were also made in a room that now had a new voice in it. I was not in the room for the first interpretive argument. Owen Grant was leading the human delegation. He called me afterward on a personal line, not a core channel, which meant the call was informal and he could say what he actually thought. "They're good," he said. "The Veth legal team is very good. We're going to need to be better." "Are we?" I asked. "We will be," he said. "Give us 6 months." He meant it literally. He had already started building the legal team. He had identified 4 people from Earth's legal academy who had specialized in cross-cultural contract interpretation and who were, in his assessment, exactly the people needed for this specific challenge. He was recruiting them. He was reading them into the situation. He was, in the methodical and unspectacular way that all the real work happens, building the capacity to win the argument over time. I offered to consult. He said he would call when he needed me. He called 4 times in the first 6 months. Each call was specific, focused, and used exactly the amount of my time that it needed. I answered every question as completely and honestly as I could and told him when I did not know something and suggested who might. The 4th call was the most interesting. It was about a precedent from 800 years ago in council legal history that the Veth team was citing, in which Owen had found a counter-precedent for that the Veth team had apparently not known about or had not expected anyone else to find. "Where did you find it?" I asked. "Suran's legal advisor," he said. "The one with the paper document. She had it." I laughed. Of course she did. 311 years of keeping track of things that might someday be useful. 311 years of careful memory. The Keth had not been passive during that time. They had been paying attention. I was thinking about all of this, about Owen and Suran and Cosvel and Vale Sue and Lucy Hartwell and Admiral Holt's 12 words, on a morning about a year after the signing, when I was sitting at my kitchen table with my actual coffee and my journal and the window open to let in the sound of the city, when my communicator showed a news notification. The notification was about a Mirren delegation. The Mirren were one of the species who had stood up in the council chamber during the final session, not one I had spoken with directly, but one whose delegate I had noticed rising from the third ring. They had submitted a formal request to the council's integration committee for a review of their existing tribute arrangement with the Veth Dominion, citing the 14th article of the Compact of Equals as the procedural basis for the review. The Veth had responded by objecting to the review on jurisdictional grounds. The Council's legal bureau had ruled, 3-1, in favor of the Mirren's right to request the review. I read the notification 3 times. Then I set down my coffee and looked out the window at the city for a while. This was the thing Suran had said would take years. This was the first step in the middle distance of a process that had no guaranteed outcome and no certain end date. The Mirren review might succeed, or it might be narrowed or delayed, or qualified into something that produced less than it promised. The 14th article might be interpreted broadly or narrowly, depending on which bureau considered it, and under what political circumstances. Every gain would need to be defended, and every defense would create new ground that then needed to be held. But the review existed. The Mirren had asked, formally and under the framework, and the legal bureau had said yes, and the question was now in the process. That had not been possible a year ago. It was possible now because 14 words had been put in a document that was signed by everyone in that room, including the Veth Dominion, including Draveth, who had signed it with the same control precision he brought to everything and who had perhaps thought, in the moment of signing, that the 14th article was a symbolic gesture that could be managed in the years of interpretation that followed. The Mirren were providing an early indication that the management would not be simple. I closed the notification. I picked up my coffee. I looked at the city. I thought about a moment I had been imagining since Suran first told me about the 311 years. I had been building it in fragments over the months since I returned. Not a specific person, not a specific event, but a specific quality of moment that I thought was possible now in a way it had not been before. Somewhere in the community of 800 inhabited systems, there was a young person who had grown up understanding in their bones the specific weight of being small in a room full of large things. Who had learned, as children learn things that the adults around them demonstrate rather than teach, that the correct response to that weight was to make yourself smaller, to speak quietly, to ask for less than you needed, to accept terms that were not fair because the alternative to accepting them was not being allowed at all. That young person was going about their day right now, on their planet, in their city, in the specific texture of their ordinary life. Maybe studying, maybe working, maybe sitting with someone they loved, or walking somewhere that mattered to them, or looking at whatever sky their planet offered and thinking about whatever was most present in their mind on that particular morning. They did not know my name. They did not know about the pen, or the protein bar, or the 3 seconds of silence, or Admiral Holt's 12 words, or Sue Rand taking the pen from me and turning it over before signing. They had read the notification about the new compact, if they had read it at all. In the quick way you read administrative news, it seems important in a general sense, but does not immediately connect to your specific life. But something had changed in the structure of the world they lived in. A clause had been added to a foundational document that their world was governed by. 14 words that had not been there before were there now. And those words were being cited in a review process by a delegation that had previously never had procedural grounds to initiate one. And someday, not this morning, maybe not this year, but someday, when the moment arrived that made it possible, that young person was going to straighten their shoulders. And they were going to do the thing that before the compact they would not have known was available to them. And they were not going to look away from whatever it was that they had always looked away from. And they were not going to do it because of me. They were going to do it because of the cumulative weight of 100 small things. Suran standing, and Orkan standing, and Elisvar standing, and the Mirren Review, and the monitoring office that Cosvel was building one case file at a time, and the legal argument that Owen's team was preparing for the next session, and the precedent that Suran's legal advisor had kept in a paper document for who knows how many decades, just in case it was someday needed. They were going to do it because the room had changed. And the room had changed because on a morning that was now a year ago, I had walked into a chamber that was already loud, sat down in a chair that was too wide, read a document 3 times, and said 2 words. I picked up the journal from my kitchen table. I opened it to the last entry I had written, the one I had written on the transport ship looking at the stars. I read what I had written there. Then I turned to a new page. I wrote, "The Mirren have initiated a formal review. The Bureau approved it 3-1. Owen says to give them 6 months." I wrote, "It is working." I put the journal down. I finished my coffee. The city made its noise outside my window, as it always did, as it always would, complicated and loud, and completely alive. I had a meeting with Director Oren in 2 hours to begin the planning process for the next phase of council engagement. There was a staffing review, and a budget proposal, and a set of decisions to make about which of the pending diplomatic contacts we should prioritize in the coming quarter. Real work, specific and detailed, the kind that did not look like the thing you had done to make it necessary. I got up from the kitchen table, rinsed out my coffee cup, and got ready to go. There was a great deal left to do. There always was. That had always been the point.
Yeah, they're good. I have low stamina anyway, bro. Alright, I'm running left corner. I'll take it. Oh, you should have stalled that. What?